Hello. Today we're going to be taking a look at Amartya Sen's really brilliant short piece called, from a much longer work, but the piece we're reading is fairly short. It's called The Idea of Justice. And we'll talk about Amartya Sen's, resume, etc., later, because the first reading after the exam is going to be Sen's work as well. So we're going to be taking a look at Sen in particular at that time. But for now, let's just get right into it. Sen presents a very memorable illustration about justice, where you're to imagine that there are three children and there's one flute, right, that they all have some claim to, right? They all claim that they should be the one that has it, and you're, in a sense, supposed to be making the decision as to who gets the flute out of these three children. Now, the idea is you're supposed to pretend that the only thing you know about the situation, first off, is that Anne, one of the three children, the other two are Ben and Carla, are, and it doesn't really matter what their names are. They're child A, child B, and child C, really. So Anne is the only one out of the three children who knows how to play the flute. The other children agree, right? Nobody disputes this. Okay, so if that's the only thing you knew about the whole situation, then it would be very clear that that would be a good reason to give Anne the flute. Okay, and so it's worth spending a little time thinking about how this justification really comes out. So the idea is that this is the distribution, right? Giving Anne the flute that has the best overall consequences. Okay, it's putting resources where those resources can be most efficiently used, and that makes sense, right? Any society should, in general, want to do that. And this makes sense with some of the vocabulary we've seen earlier. This is what Sen calls the utilitarian perspective, and it gets that name from the idea of trying to maximize expected utility, which again go all the way back to the rational choice theory lecture, and you'll see all these, and of course several of the other readings have had various language about utility and about maximizing utility and all that. Okay, so in any case, it makes sense that any society should want to allocate its resources to where those resources will do the most good, right? Where those resources will be the most useful. And that's certainly the case with Anne here. She's the only one who knows how to play the flute. But now, again, wipe your mind clear and pretend like you don't know anything about the situation and you learn a different fact. This time, what you learn is that Ben is the only one out of the three children who is so poor that he has no toys of his own, right? All the other children agree that they have plenty of toys, to keep them occupied. Ben is the only one who has nothing, right? He has and so again, if this is all you knew about the situation, this would be a fairly strong reason to give Ben the flute, okay? And again, the justification for giving Ben the flute bears a little more examination. That kind of a distribution would be the one that would be chosen from behind the veil of ignorance. If you're using Rawls's method, for example, right? Remember, the idea is to distance yourself from any kind of bias that you might have. And so say, okay, if I didn't know which of the children I was going to be, which of the children would I give the flute to? Right? But I'm going to be one of them. That's part of it. You've got a stake in this, right? You're self-interested and rational. And so the idea is you want to say, okay, well, look, if I were Ben, I would be in a very disadvantaged position, so I'd at least want to have something, and so I would give Ben the flute, right? So the idea is you give Ben the flute to insulate yourself from the risk of having absolutely nothing, right? And so that would be a kind of justification that, say, Rawls would favor. It would also be the justification that an egalitarian would favor. Rawls's theory does tend toward the egalitarian, and Sen calls it the egalitarian approach. This is an approach that says, look, it's just better if people are more equal in general. Okay, that's the egalitarian view. But I'll also notice that both the prioritarian view, the view that it's better to give a benefit to the least well-off, because again, having Ben go from 0 toys to 1 toy is going to be a lot more valuable to Ben than going from lots of toys to 1 more is to either of the other two children, right? And so there's that diminishing marginal value concept all over again. And so even the priority view would also say, give the flute to Ben. It's hard to know exactly what the sufficiency view would say, but we'll leave that as an exercise for the interested reader. But in any case, this is another justification. And again, if this is the only thing you knew about the situation, it would be very compelling to say, give the flute to Ben. Right? But now, again, wipe your mind clear. We're going to learn a different fact, and that will, again, be, a strong reason to prefer one kind of distribution over the other two. So now imagine that the only thing you know about the situation is that Carla is the one who made the flute. Again, the other children don't dispute this. They agree, yes, Carla in fact made the flute. All right. And again, if this is the only thing you knew about the situation, that would be a powerful reason to give Carla the flute. Okay, and let's again take a closer look at this justification as well. And if you can already identify which theorist is responsible for this kind of a view, good. Give yourself in some notebook or something. Give yourself one, one super bonus point or something. Whatever. Keep track of those things, right? Uh, uh, Look, this is the justification for giving Carla the flute is that it respects plausible rules about justice in acquisition and justice in transfer of goods, right? The idea is that, as long as she was entitled to the resources that she made the flute out of, it seems like she's entitled to the flute, right? She acquired it through means that seem perfectly fair. After all, if making something isn't a fair way to acquire it, I don't know what is. And so again, this accords with Nozick's entitlement theory of social distributions. Sen calls it the no-nonsense libertarian view. Okay, and that's very clear that that's the kind of angle that comes from. So again, if this is the only thing you knew about the situation, then it would be very, it would be, clear that you should give the flute to Carla. Now, of course, we have to pretend that we know all of these things at the same time, and then therein lies the trouble. So I want you to notice a couple of things about the way that the illustration has gone so far. First off, each of those justifications is in itself reasonable. It's completely reasonable that every society should want to allocate its resources where those resources will be most efficient, right? Well, where they will be the most well used, right? That absolutely makes sense. It also makes sense that if we're removing bias from the issue, or if we're trying to give a benefit to the least well off, that Ben should get some benefit, right? That a society not just simply leave people behind. That's extremely, it's extremely plausible. It's a part of every society in the world. And it's reasonable. And of course, also, it's perfectly reasonable that somebody who made the flute should be able to keep the flute, right? That's, again, very basic kind of an idea about procedural justice. So all of those justifications are, in and of themselves, reasonable. Okay, the question is now what happens when they're pitted against each other, because it seems in this case they are in fact pitted against each other. We can pick only one of them, and that's a tough call. I also want you to notice that each of those justifications is entirely impersonal. Now, we have imagined Anne saying, look, but I'm the only one who can play the flute. And we've imagined Ben saying, look, but I don't have anything else. And we've imagined Carla saying, look, I made the flute. But just imagine it goes some other way. Imagine Anne says, well, you should give the flute to Ben because Ben doesn't have anything else. And Ben says, well, no, really, you should give the flute to Carla because Carla made the flute. And Carla says, yeah, I made the flute, but you should give the flute to Anne because she's the only one who can play the flute. Notice the justifications retain their strength, whether the person who would benefit from them is the one giving you the justification or not. That's what we mean when we say a justification is impersonal. It doesn't really matter who is supplying it. It's a good justification. It's a good reason, no matter who has that reason for deciding what to do with the flute. And also, it's important to realize that there's a cost, right? So to satisfying any of these particular justifications. So you say, all right, let's have the most efficient distribution of goods possible. Well, that efficiency is going to have bad impacts potentially on the least well-off, and also will disrespect some notions about procedural justice, right? That is, giving the flute to Anne. Helping out the least well-off will not be as efficient as it could be, right? You'll pay a cost in efficiency, and you will also pay a cost in the terms of, respecting some procedural justice. But satisfying procedural justice has a cost to efficiency and also to benefiting the least well-off. That's just bad. And so if you're tempted to say, okay, fine, nobody gets the flute, that's a kind of a parent's trick, sort of. But notice that actually, if it's bad to have, the cost of doing away with two of these justifications, how much worse is it to do away with all three? And so as much as that might be a kind of, temporary solution to a problem, it certainly, it doesn't really make anything better. In fact, it's the worst of the available options is nobody gets the flute, right? Because instead of satisfying one of these justifications, we satisfy none of them. Right. So that's just tough, right? That's just a hard part about this, and I think that's just as Sen intends it. Sen wants it to be a hard choice. He wants to make you stop and think, right? Which is always a good thing to do. And I think I also want to point out here that the number of justifications is not necessarily limited to three, right? There might be other kinds of views about justice that might counsel a different sort of an action. You could add a fourth child that has yet a fourth justification, which also sounds pretty good, or a fifth, which has a fifth justification that also sounds pretty good. I mean, these three are theories that we happen to have talked about in class. They are some of the major ideas. And, you know, three is a nice simple number. It's a simple number of cases to keep track of. But look, there's no reason why there couldn't possibly be even more that would make the decision even more difficult, right? But here we're faced with the three, and so let's go on that assumption. So I think what happens here is that when people see situations like this, like the one that Sen gives us, I think that they are tempted to immediately fasten upon the wrong answer. Okay. And I think the wrong answer is to say, look, one of these ideas about justice matters and the other don't, right? The others don't matter at all. I think that's the wrong answer. If you say, well, obviously it should go to one of these children and those other justifications are just, I think that's fairly obviously the wrong answer. And I think what makes people do that is that we're dealing with a forced choice here. In this thought experiment, there just is one flute, right? But the point is to make us think about social justice, is to make us think about the way that things should be distributed in a society and why people should get how much of what they get and what the system ought to be. And in a society, we have more than one good, right? We have to play this game all over the place with lots of different goods all the time. And so we have to start to, I think to get Sen's point, we have to start moving away from these kinds of stark forced choices precisely because those kinds of choices are not representative of the choices faced when somebody is really determining the best social distribution or the best theory of justice. Really, any society has to divvy up all kinds of different sorts of goods, and again, not just resources, not just money, but access and power and privilege and all that sort of stuff. All societies have to divvy that stuff up. And so when we're dealing especially with that kind of a situation, we look like we're facing much more of a design problem than a stark forced choice like Sen delivers us. And again, I think the reason he does this is not because he thinks that's the way societies really are, but that he wants people to really think, right? And that certainly I think he does well in that goal. So I mentioned design problems. What are design problems? Well, here's how we're going to imagine a design problem. I'm going to give you a new illustration. Okay, so I want you to imagine that you're an architect, right? And that your client wants a building and they're in the right place because you're an architect, right? You say, hey, if you want a building, you're in the right place because I'm an architect. Okay, great. You're an architect, they want a building, things are already going well. Here's what they give you. They say, all right, here's what's important to me. I want the building to look good. Okay, I want a beautiful building. I want that building to be sustainable. That's what we're calling it now. It used to be people call it a green building, but yeah, it's too easy to misunderstood. It's like, no, you don't want a building that's the color green. You want a building that is environmentally friendly, right? That uses materials that are sustainable, that is energy efficient, you know, all that sort of stuff that goes into sustainable architecture, green architecture, environmentally friendly architecture. Use whatever adjective you want to describe this. I've used the word sustainable over there in the PowerPoint. And they also say, look, we also don't want to pay a lot of money, right? You know, we're not made of money. Nobody is. So, you know, yeah, we want it to be, you know, as cost effective as possible. We want a cheap building, right? You know, and so now think about this for a second. Is your first instinct to say, okay, well, I'm going to make the most beautiful building I can, and it's not going to be very sustainable, and it's going to be really expensive. So that's just what you're going to get, right? Or is the right answer to say, no, 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 I'm going to make a really ugly building that's super expensive because it uses all of these high-tech materials that are tremendously energy efficient, et cetera, and that's what you're going to get. Or you want to say, okay, fine, you want a cheap building, I give you a cheap building. It's a little concrete box, right? You know, got to put one door in it, you know, or however many doors, a minimum for fire code, and no windows, you know, that's extra expense. It's going to be very ugly and very non-environmentally friendly. You know, we're going to put no effort into those other things. Don't all three of those approaches seem like the absolute wrong approach, right? It seems like you should have been kicked out of architecture school well before that point, if that's the way you tend to think about things. And so I think we have to apply this kind of an analysis to, you know, to to social justice. But let's talk about how to sort of optimize some of these various, to some extent, incompatible design parameters. So, for example, this here is the Walt Disney Concert Hall, right? It's designed by an architect by the name of Frank Gehry, and it's beautiful, right? Also rather expensive, okay? But it's even more than that, it's been criticized for being pretty wasteful of materials. Like just imagine the interior volume of all of those, sort of curves and graceful, graceful lines there. I mean, I think Frank Gehry basically doesn't like straight lines at all, and it's again, it's definitely not the most efficient use of material. It's definitely not the most efficient use of interior volume, etc. Right? So but it's very beautiful, right? So it's both beautiful and expensive, but perhaps not very efficient. And so you see a way of getting a couple of things, right? But not some of the others. And of course, this building here, this is the Abraj Al Bait. It's very classy, very good looking. It's actually huge. If you put like Big Ben next to that clock face, it looks absolutely tiny, right? This is a very, very big, very impressive building. It's in Saudi Arabia. And that big crescent that's up the top there, that's like like fiberglass plated with like real gold. Okay, and it's a lot of gold. This building, again, it's beautiful. I imagine it's not probably used as the most sustainable materials. I mean, gold is not exactly, the reason that gold is pricey is partially because of its comparative rarity with other types of things. And so it's not that efficient really. But yeah, and also it's the most expensive building in the world, costs $15 billion. So again, there's an example of how, prioritizing one of these kinds of design constraints might, really sort of blow some of the others out of the water. Uh, but then you could have, other buildings that are much more sustainable, right? So such as these here, and I don't actually know where these are, but I thought, oh, green architecture, there you go, that's what that is. But notice again how much vegetable matter there is all the way up, and actually that's very hard to do from a design perspective because you have to, all of that dirt, right, is heavy, the water is heavy, right? That you have to think of like actual, sunlight, so these things don't just die. You have to, think about what happens as they grow, and change. And like this is tremendously high maintenance, even if it is sort of green in the sense of very sort of it integrates a lot of biomass in it. Um, this might be one of the more expensive ways, right? And I don't know, you can sort of say what you like. I think some might really like it and some might really hate it in terms of aesthetics. But it's certainly a statement. Okay, it's one way of maximizing one thing, but it's going to be costly, and it you might not really like the way that looks, and it's going to be hard to maintain that look also, right? Again, plants grow, plants change, plants die, etc. But we could look instead at the sculpture building and gallery. This is at Yale University. So we're looking at well, let me pull up the little laser pointer for now. So yeah, so we're looking at this building here. Like this here, this is a beautiful sort of Gothic tower here. That's it's gorgeous, right? And probably very old. But this here, not so gorgeous. It's just I don't know. I'm sure there's some like reason for this being the way it is, and it's a highly sustainable building. And I imagine it wasn't as expensive as like building a nice big Gothic thing would have been. And so there's some cost effectiveness in there, but it's pretty ugly. Not of course as ugly as this here. This is Wesco Hall. This is on the University of Kansas. I worked in this building for kind of a long time. Um, while I was in graduate school. In fact, the day that I moved to Lawrence to enter graduate school, I moved my stuff into our apartment, and I went and bought a newspaper the next morning, and the front page story was about the Kansas opening an investigation because a number of people who worked in this building for a long period of time were diagnosed with brain tumors, and so they were wondering if it was something in the building's environs, whether like the air, the water, or something that was causing all that. It turned out it was not. It was just a statistical coincidence. Such things do happen. We have not seen a continued rash of people diagnosed with brain tumors who had worked in Wesco Hall. So, but yeah, that was a great thing to sort of wake up to. But it's very ugly. It's a big concrete bunker. The student newspaper, the University Daily Kansan, once joked that it had been named to the National Registry of Eyesores and Monstrosities, along with the Los Angeles County landfill. So. Yeah, it's very ugly, and part of the reason it's so ugly is because for cost reasons. I mean, there's everyone actually. If you talk to people who've been associated with the University of Kansas for a long time, spend any real good amount of time there, everybody has a different version of the story of why Wesco's so ugly. But it all comes down to some kind of cost-saving measure. And so the idea is that this is sort of what happens when you sort of prioritize cost over really all else. You end up with a very ugly building that's also it's not an efficient building either. So there you go. So again, the idea is to try and blend these things as much as possible. Have some elements that are there for efficiency without making it too expensive or too ugly. And you want to make a pretty building without making it too inefficient or too expensive. And again, the idea is you want to get as much of the criteria as you can get without trading too much off against any of the others. That's the way design problems work. That's the way people go toward design problems. So let's start applying this then to our questions about social justice. So the idea is that, and anytime you get closer to issues in value, issues in justice, when you talk about morality, you're going to quickly run into this idea that there are lots of different ideas about morality and about justice and about what's valuable that are plausible ideas. They're sensible, they all work, they're good ideas. They just can't all be true at the same time, or they can't all be satisfied at once. And so such is the case with justice. And I think it's very important to realize that designing a society is like designing anything else, where there's a lot of different things that matter, and you can't have all of them at once. And the wrong answer is to just get one of those things and leave everything else aside, right? That's how you do bad design. And that's how, in general, you can get a bad society. And so that leaves us with a rather different moral of the story. And that's this one here, that real conflicts, okay, like real conflicts between people are rarely, if ever, between good and evil, right? That's the way things are in the movies, right? Because people want to turn their brains off a little bit when they watch a movie, and that's fine. But that's not reality, okay? Reality isn't usually a good versus evil thing, but generally it's a conflict between people with very differing and usually reasonable conceptions of the good. Again, many people are short-sighted enough that they don't recognize that conceptions of the good other than their own can be reasonable. But I think most people, when push comes to shove, if somebody could explain their view of the good, another person would say, yeah, look, that is reasonable, but it seems like you can't do that at the same time as you do this other thing. And that's going to be true. Okay, and so the idea is that we have to, together as a society, as individuals, we have to think better about this. We have to talk in a better way about this, and we have to try and seek out what kinds of, what different ideas of justice are in play when we talk about various different ways of changing our own society or moving our own society forward. And we have to realize that progress made in some areas may sometimes trade off against a progress made in others, and that what we really don't want to do is we really don't want to maximize one kind of an idea at the expense of all others. Right, so that I think is a reasonable takeoff of what Sen is trying to get us to do. He's trying to get us to recognize the inherent justice in some very different ways of looking at a particular situation.